All right, everyone, welcome back to another episode of Christianity on the Spectrum. So, this episode is going to be quite a bit different than most episodes that you've heard so far. So, for those of you who don't know who I am, my name is John. I am a autism researcher. I also have autism. I have ASD1. I was diagnosed with Asperger's when I was 16 years old. And for the last 10 years, I have been doing a longitudinal study. I think it's the largest longitudinal study in the English-speaking world on autistic religious people. I've surveyed over 26,000 Christian and ex-Christian autistic people online, and I do a lot of ethnographic research into autism and online autism communities and things like that. And I've basically been doing this as a hobby for the last 10 years. And now I have a podcast where I try to explain all of my research findings from doing this long-term longitudinal study of these online populations. I just want to add a quick clarification for anyone coming from Freddy's audience who isn't really familiar with the context of this podcast or my research project. So I'm a researcher that focuses exclusively on ASD1, and we talk about things as they relate to ASD1. So when we're saying autism, most of the time we're talking about ASD1, and the reason that we're having this discussion on Freddy's work is the implications of Freddy's work for people with ASD1. So I just want to manage expectations and make sure that people are understanding that this conversation is intentionally about ASD1 and not ASD2 and ASD3. So I started this podcast back on the 23rd of September in 2024, which is a very long time ago now. I didn't expect that I would be publishing episodes this long, but I started this podcast to basically explain my work. And even before that, a lot of autistic people who knew me would send me a link to a certain Substack article and be like, "Hey, John, what do you think about this?" Because for many autistic people, I am the autism understander in their life. And I'm the guy they go to when they read something about autism and they don't know what to think about it. They send me the article. And so the article was an article by Freddie deBoer called The Gentrification of Disability. And then since publishing my podcast, I've had a very wide range of audiences from a variety of political perspectives. And once or twice every month, I get someone sending me these articles saying, "Hey, have you seen this? What do you think about this?" And I usually have to give long, complicated, nuanced answers in the form of a essay. And I just thought, you know what? I should put out an episode about this because clearly people want to know my thoughts on this issue and on Freddie deBoer's critique of neurodiversity. And so I thought, yeah, I'll do that. I have been following Freddie long before he first published the article about the gentrification of disability. I think I've been following him since around 2018. So I'm very familiar with his work, very familiar with the place that he's coming from in his critiques. And I'm probably more sympathetic to him than most people would realize and most people would initially suspect. Freddie has been quite controversial in online autism communities, and as a person who researches online autism communities, people kind of expect me to, debunk him and trash him, and that is not at all my perspective on these issues. I think he brings up a lot of points that really need to be talked about and really need to be addressed. And so this episode is going to be doing that. Now, I originally was going to do an episode where I just took the 3 articles that he did and go through them and just go through point by point and address them. However, I thought maybe he could just come on the podcast and explain them. And so I sent him an email, and lo and behold, he responded, which was pretty cool. And we did an interview. And this interview was great, and I was planning on releasing the whole thing. However, as a amateur podcaster, I sometimes don't check input settings on my audio, which I now do very religiously since interviewing him. I always check the input. However, the audio input during the interview from me was coming from my webcam mic. And so the audio from my side sounds like I am recording in the middle of a microwave while that microwave is turned on. It is brutal sound quality. And I couldn't edit the episode, like I couldn't listen to myself in that quality. And so I thought this must be way worse for other people. And so Freddy's audio came through very clearly, though, and very well. And I didn't want to bother him by asking him to do basically the same interview again. He has much better things to do with his time, I'm sure. So, what we're going to do in this episode is go through that interview with him. And to help me with that, I have brought back returning guest on this podcast, Alyssa.
Hi, my name is Alyssa. I was on the Cults and Fundamentalism episodes a while back. I am not an autism researcher. I am or a doctor or historian or activist or anything like that. I am an unaccredited Latin teacher and amateur mime. Those are the qualifications I bring to this. Like every podcast needs a mime. But I am a late diagnosed autistic woman in my 30s. I got a bonus surprise diagnosis when my kids got diagnosed when they were 5 and 8.
So I brought on Alyssa because I think Alyssa comes from a perspective much different than mine and has experiences that I definitely don't have and can talk about these things in ways that I tend not to. I come at these issues from a very analytical perspective, and she can come at these issues from a more experiential perspective. So that is what we're going to do for this episode. So I think the best thing to do would just be to start off by letting Freddy introduce himself to my audience, who I doubt really know much about him, except the people that send me his articles. We'll play that clip here.
So I am a writer, a professional writer. I used to be in academia for a long time. I got a PhD in writing, studied a lot of education research and literacy research, things like that. I worked for the City University of New York for 4 or 5 years as an administrator. But now I'm just a full-time writer. I write books and I write a newsletter. I used to freelance a lot for newspapers and magazines. I don't really do that anymore. But yeah, I sort of at the intersection of a bunch of things that are sort of interface with all this stuff. I mean, for one thing, I have been not really now, because now I live in the suburbs and have a young baby, but I've been an activist for most of my life, for my adult life. I spent a great deal of time in the anti-Iraq war movement in the early 2000s. I did a lot of grad student organizing, like labor organizing when I was in grad school. I was in the New York City tenants' rights movement, sort of like doing tenant advocacy, like against like shitty landlords for 6 or 7 years. And so I have a sort of like that background. So I've been in a lot of activist spaces. I grew up in a sort of lefty activist sort of household. And then, and in academia, which is where disability studies really comes from, ultimately those ideas. I was in the humanities, so I interfaced with them there. But also, I have bipolar disorder myself and spent a lot of my life dealing with the consequences of that, in and out of treatment for that. And I have a profound set of complaints about the way that those issues are discussed publicly. I am a fierce opponent of the anti-psychiatry movement. And I think that the mainstream media is far too sort of anti-psychiatry credulous, particularly the New York Times, which is a publication that I've dinged for this over and over again. And sort of being at that sort of intersection sort of led me naturally to talk a great deal about autism, because autism is sort of the pointy end of the stick right now when it comes to definitions of disability, who is disabled, what it means to be disabled, what affordances we have a responsibility to extend to people with disabilities. And I think particularly I would say is that a dynamic that was very common in sort of my neck of the woods is anti-psychiatry people have a vested interest in representing people with serious mental illnesses as not impaired. right? Because that's sort of core to their sort of belief in the world, is that, like, society is wrong and not people with mental illnesses. And there's also a sort of social justice-y, sort of politically liberal sort of inclination to be, to treat stigma as like the biggest problem that mentally ill people face, which I think is absurd. And so when you're in that position and you're saying we need to represent people with serious mental illnesses as not impaired, when you have people who genuinely are severely impaired, right? Like they become inconvenient for you. If you are constantly saying that people with mental illness are not violent, the people with mental illness who are violent become deeply inconvenient for your project. And so over time, what happens is those people get moved further and further into the background and into the margins of the discussion. And over the last decade or so, I've sort of observed the same thing happening with neurodiversity and autism, which is that the insistence that autism is not a deficit, that there's nothing wrong with people who have autism, that autism is not a disorder, it's a disability, but not a disorder, is something that people say, which makes no sense to me. Because for that exact same sort of dynamic, the people for whom autism absolutely is obviously a serious deficit, meaning people with level 3 autism, this profoundly autistic or severely autistic, people who are nonverbal, who are often violent, typically violent against themselves, who can't control their bathroom functions and have to wear diapers into adulthood, who have all manner of profound limitations on what they can do, precisely because autism clearly is a deficit for them. They have become inconvenient to many people in the neurodiversity movement. And over time, they have been shunted farther and farther to the side in the public conception of what autism is.
I think the only additional thing I would add when we're talking about this, when we're talking about people profoundly affected by autism, we typically say people with ASD3, because that is the biggest example of the people who are most affected by autism and who are the most disabled. However, I would also just like to add, for clarity and for other people listening, people with ASD1 and ASD2 are also profoundly affected by autism, and the people who aren't profoundly affected by autism are a very small minority of ASD1, I would say. They typically are a very privileged group of people, and they aren't sort of reflective of the whole of ASD1. And I think that's really the only nuancing things I would add to that. Anything from your end, Alyssa?
Yeah, so when I was diagnosed, which is not that long ago, I'm only like a year and a half out, the language that I was introduced to from my kids' doctors and from the educational, like the psychoeducational materials that they gave us, didn't use ASD 1, 2, 3 as the default language. It used low support needs, medium support needs, and high support needs. And I did not know that 1, 2, and 3 existed. That's not how they talked to me about it where I am in the States. And I think that varies dramatically depending on who your doctor is. But I have noticed that in more activist spaces, the preferred language is definitely low, medium, and high support needs. And some of them will take issue with 1, 2, and 3. I don't strongly have a preference which one. I find that if I am speaking to people on behalf of my children, it is easier to explain low, medium, and high support needs than it is to explain what these numbers mean.
Yeah. And so in my head, 1, 2, and 3, and low, medium, high is basically just like they're one-to-one mappings.
I
And
see this as a
yeah,
semantic difference. I know
yeah,
some people do not see it as a semantic difference. They
yeah.
they clash over it.
Yeah, and I don't know. I think these, so from a researcher perspective and a just analytics perspective, support needs labels aren't very particularly useful in doing analytics, in understanding populations, in understanding how these things affect things, and then applying policies. Support needs doesn't really properly make all the connections that you need to when you're having these discussions. So, me personally, I use 1, 2, and 3 just because when you're coming from a more analytical, statistical side of things and trying to understand effects at population levels, 1, 2, and 3 I mean, there's a reason the scientific community uses 1, 2, and 3 in papers, and why the medical community tends to use it. And I mean, with some small exceptions. And it's basically just because 1, 2, and 3 are still useful distinctions, because these are autism affects you very differently if you're ASD1, if you're ASD2, and if you're ASD3. Like there are measurable differences between these populations. And I think it's really important to add that. And I just think that, with although people with ASD3 are definitely the most affected by autism, I think sometimes what happens in discourse is we go, look, people with ASD1 don't have ASD3. And it's like, yeah, this is obvious. We know this. But they also go, so that means people with ASD1 are fine or aren't affected by autism. Now, I want to be really clear. Freddy doesn't do this, but this is just things that pop up around there, and I just want to make sure that's clear.
And so it makes sense that those 1, 2, and 3 labels make the most sense when you are doing research, when you are working with science. When I am working with my kid's piano teacher, or trying to talk to a swimming lessons teacher, I don't need to I cannot assume that they know even what the DSM is. I, but I can say my kid has low or medium support needs, and that is more understandable and easier to explain to somebody without giving them a whole explanation of what autism is. But low support needs is not no support needs.
Yeah, that is crucial. There are
It's
still
just,
support needs. They're a very different set though, and a very different class. And I one of the difficulties with low support, medium support, and high support is a lot of people sort of semantically think that the category of low support needs is basically the same as medium support. It's just more of the same support that they need. But that is not the case. The case is that the low support needs is one set of support needs that are typically low intensity interventions. Medium support are a different set of support needs that are higher intensity interventions, and high support needs are a different set of support needs that are usually require high intensity. So the low, medium, and high is reference to the sort of intensity and consistency that these support needs need to be applied. So if you have low support needs, it's sort of you need support, but they're low intensity and typically not 24/7. Whereas high support needs, high intensity, constant monitoring, constant supervision all the time. So yeah, that's that distinction that people sometimes get confused by. And so I wanted to basically just introduce Freddy's ideas more by talking about his articles. Now, I recommend that before you get into this discussion, you actually go read the articles. I think they are well written and digestible. The hairs might start standing up on the back of your neck. Your spidey senses might be tingling. I would encourage you to fight through those feelings and just read the damn articles, because I think they are worth reading, and I think the critiques he presents are worth it. So before you listen to the rest of this podcast, I think it is important that you actually read the articles so that you understand what's going on here. I will link them all in the description in the order that I recommend you read them. Before reading his articles, I would actually recommend first that you watch a YouTube video that he made in response to Daniel Bergner's piece in the New York Times about psychotic disorders, because it does a very good job of explaining where he's coming from and why he's making the critique that he's making. And I find a lot of autistic people, when they first read his articles, are very resistant to hearing what he has to say. But the video does a very good job of giving better context as to why he's actually saying it. My recommendation for reading his material or digesting his material, specifically his critiques about neurodiversity, would be to first watch that YouTube video. Then I'm quite serious about that. It's only 10 minutes long. The next article I would recommend is What's the Problem with Disability Studies and the Disability Rights Movement? listeners to this podcast will recognize many of the critiques that he makes in various podcast episodes that I've already made. Like, one of the first critiques he makes is that disability rights rhetoric implies a community of the disabled that doesn't exist. And that's a point I frequently make about autistic communities. Like, the autism community, as it's often referenced, doesn't exist. And there is not an autism community, but there are large groups of competing autism communities with a wide variety of different disparate interests that are often competing against each other. The second article I would recommend is The Gentrification of Disability, which is his overall critique of how ASD1 and the priorities of people with ASD1 have overtaken the needs and the priorities of people with ASD3. And then finally, the last article, which is Who Neurodiversity Left Behind, which is a more specific critique of neurodiversity and who neurodiversity is and is not for, and is not working for. Again, I understand people in my audience are not going to really appreciate what he has to say about a lot of these things, but I think this is a necessary conversation to actually have, and I think his writing is actually worth it. When it comes to critiques of the neurodiversity movement, I think he is the best game in town as far as coherence goes. So I would recommend just giving those a read before listening to the rest of this podcast so you have a better context. One of my biggest frustrations with the articles that he put out that I brought up with Freddy was that he mostly focuses on ASD3, but when I'm trying to make a similar critique, and I make a similar critique to him, I would include a lot of people with ASD1 and ASD2 as having profoundly negative experiences with autism that are not reflected in autism advocacy either. And so I brought it up. And here's what Freddie had to say about that.
So, I mean, let me pull a few things apart here because I really want to nuance this because I think it's important. So there's a first sort of things like about level 1 autism itself, right? And level 2, which is the missing middle that almost never gets talked about, including by me, right? And level 3. And there's sort of like the whole sort of set of discussions about the sort of relationship between those things. One thing we can talk about if we move forward in this is that so many people I talk to, including people who are really don't like what I write about these things, so many people think that there's just no point in rolling up level 1 and level 3 into the same diagnosis. That is just not good for anybody. But that fundamentally, because of like how funding works and because of how like the medical field works, there are real practical difficulties of sort of disaggregating them. So there's that whole conversation there. But there's a whole other conversation, which I also think is important, which is like some of the people say that like they think that I don't believe in autism level 1 or level 1 autism, or that like I don't think that it's like an issue, which is not at all true. I think that there are, as you said, just profoundly different concerns for people in these two groups. But there's sort of that. But to me, like, I mean, look, like interacting with you on an online call for 10 minutes, you present to me as someone on the autism spectrum. In other words, to me, like there are aspects of the way in which you interact, which like connect with autistic people that I've interacted with my entire life, right? So like, there's that sort of autism level 1. One thing that really people are simultaneously very touchy about, but also kind of know what I'm talking about, is what I sometimes call, I mean, obviously pejoratively, level 0 autism, which is people who just straight up just call themselves that. And I'm forever trying to sort of nuance this distinction with people, and I understand why they're touchy about it. It is just the case, right, that there is now a layer of people who I believe them when they say that their autism has never been a deficit, because look, like you just said, like I've interacted and met and have known and met and interacted with enough level 1 autistic people to recognize that they in particular have social and communicative problems that have a real negative impact on their life, which is precisely what inspires, it's precisely the sort of thing which inspires the concept of reasonable accommodation and accommodating people with disabilities. But more and more often, I interact with people where I don't recognize anything in their way of interacting with the world that reminds me of autism. They themselves will tell you that they've never faced difficulty or hardship. That's kind of core to their sort of activist identity. They are flourishing in every way you can imagine, including social and communicative as well. And I just think that there's this real sort of pollutant in this conversation, which is there's an already complicated set of issues about level 1, 2, and 3 autism. Should they be the same diagnosis? Should we bring back Asperger's, etc.? But then there's just, frankly, a lot of frivolous people who are looking for sympathy and attention, who see that calling yourself autistic gets you a certain kind of cachet online. And there's both no social cost to them for doing so in a sort of online heavy experience. And also there's a sort of profound sort of, in liberal spaces at least, there's a profound prohibition against questioning somebody's diagnosis in that way. And so there's no reason not to. They feel like it makes them look interesting or important. And like that to me has to be understood and discussed. And I think there's a lot of people who think that just like having that conversation at all necessarily entails like casting skepticism on their level 1 diagnosis. And I just don't agree. Like, I just think that, like, you know, there's all kinds of diseases that are real that sometimes people kind of fake. And I mean, part of my frustration with this discussion is a lot of the neurodiversity people don't even want to begin to have the conversation of, okay, like this, you know, 20-year-old Brown student read an article on BuzzFeed and self-diagnosed as autistic and is now all over TikTok lecturing everybody about what it means, you know? And I mean, to me, like, as someone with a pretty serious disability, the experience of disability is sort of defined by impairment, right? Like, this is part of why it is so hard for me to know where to go when people insist that autism has no impairment, because it's like that's what makes it a disability, right? Is being impaired. And one of the things I hate about the position that I found myself in, and I acknowledge that this is partially my fault, but it's like this slippage between people thinking I'm saying, oh, there's no such thing as level 1 autism, or those people aren't actually suffering, or nobody actually, none of that is what I'm saying. What I am saying is that you have this already complicated set of issues that the DSM has really foisted on people within their wisdom. But then you also have this super, super emotionally charged activist conversation that is made much, much harder by the fact that there are just people whose autism is plainly a trend, you know?
The first point Freddie makes is that we need to differentiate between ASD1 and ASD3 and create separate categories. I'm like, whatever, sure. I'm not super tied to any specific label. The only thing I would say is we do need a label for ASD1. There is a push, especially from the parents of children with ASD3, to say ASD1 isn't a real thing. Freddie would not agree with that. I would not agree with that. Frankly, I don't care what we call it, just as long as we have something to call it. Like, should we revert it back to Asperger's? I don't know. I think people would be pretty upset with that.
I don't remember. The trouble with this is I don't remember how to pronounce her name. Grunya Sukareva, like the Soviet Union. She was a Jewish woman and she researched autism and published papers on it before Asperger did. And she studied boys and girls. So maybe
Yep,
we take her name. Let's take her name.
sure. Or
I will have to learn how to pronounce it.
let's take like a prominent person who had ASD1 and just name it
Greta.
after them. Yeah, name it Greta syndrome or something after our fearless queen,
The
Greta
trouble is
Thunberg.
you'd have people who wanted to name it Greta syndrome and people who wanted to name it Elon syndrome, and these are probably both ASD1 people, and these are not in the same community.
Compromise, Elon Greta syndrome.
Ah,
Uh, anyway, I don't care what we call it. I think his point is well taken. I have very frequently said people with ASD1 and people with ASD3 are very different, have very different needs. The supports that we need are so different from each other that there is almost no overlap. The interventions we need, the support we need is so different. It's like, what are we doing here? Why are we doing this? Why are we under the same category? It's a fair thing to say. The only pushback against this that I would say is ASD 1, 2, and 3 are not neatly distinct categories. There are, if you envision this, as a Venn diagram, the ASD1 and ASD2 have some overlap, and ASD2 and ASD3 have some overlap. And as you develop as a child, specifically, many children will go from ASD3 to ASD2. Many children will go from ASD2 to ASD1. Many children will go from ASD1 to ASD2. There is fluidity between these categories that might make this a little more confusing, where you have to like get re-diagnosed with a separate thing. That's the only real complication that I can see. But I think his point about like funding and things like that is well taken. And quite frankly, if we want to name this Elon Greta syndrome, let's do it. Like, I need a name for this.
I would also assume that whether you, especially if you are in the overlap of the Venn diagram, whether you are clocked as 2 or 3 or 2 or 1 is going to depend very much not only on your both the competence and the subjective opinion of your assessor, but also how much you trust them and the kind of day you're having. Like, it's going to be pretty subjective.
Yeah. And so the only pushback that I would give to splitting these formally into completely different diagnoses is that there is a level of subjectivity that is involved, and there's a sort of gray area between 1 and 2 and 3. But even then, like, maybe there are better ways to handle this. I'm not a clinician. I'm a researcher. Like, so I've often said, let's just keep calling it ASD. Like, let's use autism like a broad category, like amputee. Autism is the broad general category of amputee. ASD1 would be like partial single limb amputation. And then ASD3 would be like full quad limb amputation. Both of these categories are amputee, but one needs significantly more help and accommodation. One needs arm prosthesis, and one needs a full time caregiver. So neither of them are not amputees. They're just different classes and category of amputee. And I think as long as we make that really clear from the start, and for funding and research purposes, make a hard split for them so that money can be effectively given to the right places and triage can be done more effectively. This is a point I've made, I think, in 4 different episodes right now, that we need to triage better, and we need to focus, like ASD3 top priority, then ASD2, then some portions of ASD1, other portions of ASD1, and then finally people like me.
Can I attempt a non-medical analogy?
Absolutely.
Because the if you have activist listeners, the medical analogy is going to again set off alarms for them. If you know how in some languages the names of colors are different, where they divide the color wheel, they'll divide it in different places. And in English, we have all these colors of red, let's say, and we would say they're all red. They may have some other things mixed into them. There's like fire engine red and brick red and maroon, and then like maroon red, and then there's pink. Pink is light red. It's just light red, but we have given it a different name. And there are other languages where they would do the same thing with the color blue. They wouldn't say light blue. They have a totally different name for this color, light blue. I am not saying that the syndrome formerly known as Asperger's isn't in the family of autism. We had a different name for it, and the name, was the equivalent of pink. It's still in the red family, but because it has a specific name, it was recognized differently. And that doesn't mean it still has things in common with maroon. It still is made of some of the same pigments, but in different values and with different uses.
But I think the big point that Freddie would push home is that in terms of policy and funding and resource allocation, these need to be separate categories.
I do think sometimes when, at least in short form video, when people are pushing back on that, it is because they are seeing not, this is a description of how these groups are different, but they are seeing a value judgment, not of these people have a harder time and these other people have an easier time. What they're seeing instead is these people are worse people and these other people like us, ASD1, formerly Asperger's, whatever, are better people. who should actually take over. And you start to get that. And so they not only want to distance themselves from the neurotypicals who they imagine as like one large group, but also want to distance themselves from who they see as these stereotypes of autism, but what is
From
actually
the
people with
Elon
much
Musks of the
higher,
world.
yes, but what is actually people with much higher support needs. And so they're not, I think when people say, no, we're not separate, this is all one thing, it's because we're not trying to say that these people are better people. There is not moral superiority. And in some corners of the internet, you do see people straight up saying, like, we low support needs autistics are just better people, more moral, more just, more
Yes.
whatever. And that is nonsense. So
Yes.
trying to say, like, no, we have things in common with these people who are much more obviously disabled than we are, I think has good intentions, and I understand where it's coming from, but I do think Freddie has a point about that makes triage harder.
Yep. Yep, absolutely. The second thing he brought up is this concept. He pejoratively labels it ASD 0. And so I asked Freddie what he thought ASD 0 was.
Here, I'll make an analogy, okay? I'll compare this to another situation, which is a little more clear-cut in that almost no one, not no one, but almost no one thinks this is real. You may have heard of dissociative identity disorder TikTok, DID TikTok. So for the listeners at home, dissociative identity disorder is the term that now encompasses what used to be called multiple personality disorder. Multiple personality disorder, dissociative identity disorder is extraordinarily controversial within psychiatry. There are some very serious clinicians who feel that it essentially doesn't exist. Most of the major cases that sort of brought multiple personality disorder into public light have eventually been proven to be fraudulent. So, for example, the most famous case was this woman named Sybil. I mean, pseudonym, but and from like the sort of the 1960s, I think I want to say, was when she really came to prominence. But she was a patient who presented as having multiple personality disorder. Her psychiatrist wrote her up in a series of articles and then books, and they did a big tour. The psychiatrist became a celebrity because of it. Eventually, this woman, Sybil, wrote a series of letters to the psychiatrist in which she said, I never had multiple personalities. And she said that this was a woman who had endured terrible abuse and terrible neglect when she was a child. She was not taken seriously by anyone. And the only time that she started to be taken seriously and receive the support she needed was that when she said she had multiple personalities, because the doctors who were treating her found that so novel and interesting that they responded to it. And so she responded in kind. So that's a good example. And then what happened next was, and we know because we have the letters, that psychiatrist proceeded to tell this patient that if she went public with this information, she would cut her off financially. And at that point, she was totally financially dependent on the psychiatrist. So she went to her grave, not telling anyone that she didn't actually have multiple personality disorder. That sort of thing is more common than not. And even people who think it's real, traditionally, like the number of like plausible cases has been in the 3 figures, right? It's been in the hundreds. As of like 5 years ago, there's the birth of what's called dissociative identity disorder TikTok, which is that it is almost universally, pretty much universally, adolescent women, so like young women between the ages like 14 and 22 maybe, on TikTok, who claim to have dissociative identity disorder and who perform that disorder for TikTok. And they engage in a bunch of behaviors that are totally contrary to what we understand about that disorder. It's one of the absolute bedrock things that's known about multiple personality disorder is one personality does not know what the other one is doing, but these people clearly know what the other personality is doing. One personality cannot control the other personality. They tend to actually actively fight what the other personalities want, but these ones would act in concert to do fashion shows and stuff like that. This is the sort of thing that I talk about that some people say, like, who cares? They're just stupid kids on the internet. Why does it matter? But here's a good example of why it matters. So McLean Hospital in Massachusetts is one of the premier psychiatric hospitals in the world. It is the psychiatric hospital that's attached to Harvard Medical School. And there was some doctors there who were finding that parents were bringing their kids who had decided that they had dissociative identity disorder from watching TikTok. These panicked parents were bringing their kids to the hospital, and it was sucking up a bunch of resources because these kids just plainly didn't have it. It was just a trendy, cool thing to do. So this doctor wrote an article, and he did a lecture, and he put the lecture notes and stuff up on the website at McLean and said, hey, this is a factitious disorder, and we need to treat it appropriately, not waste resources on it. DID TikTok got a hold of that. They started a massive controversy. They got just a huge amount of negative press. They started an effort to get this guy's medical license taken away. And eventually McLean caved and they deleted all references to his argument because it wasn't worth the controversy. Like, to me, like, that's worst case scenario in every sense, right? It's at least, in those cases, most people will say, oh, yeah, that's not real. And one of the biggest things, the part of the reason that I find it so unfortunate is that if you look at the people who have the most plausible case of having dissociative identity disorder, they're people with just destroyed lives, right? I mean, they're people with just enormous chronic problems who just live totally desperate lives and ruined lives. And then you have these photogenic 19-year-olds saying, I'm the face of dissociative identity disorder. And I admit that, like, part of why this stuff always bothers me is because I just find it kind of vulgar on, like, an emotional sense. But so you say, okay, like, if you look at that, like, that's kind of an extreme personal performance to go through, right? Of a rare disorder that you don't actually have. And I just think that the answer, like, why would people do that is, human beings will do almost anything to get attention and sympathy, I mean, I sometimes analogize it to all the cases of fake cancer diagnosis online, which is this enormous thing. Like, I mean, there are these big communities online of, like, fake cancer sort of hoax spotters or whatever, because it's happening so often that people fake cancer online. And it's like, that's a big deal, and it has really negative potential consequences. But people want attention and they want to receive sympathy from people. And I think that you have in any of this stuff, behavioral, cognitive, psychiatric, etc. things, the diagnostic criteria are always going to be loose enough that anyone can push their way through if they want to. And you have a community, right? If you, like, go online, if you're someone who's lonely and you want to feel like other people are invested in you, these giant autism communities now, the neurodiversity communities, and they're just telling you every day, you're good, you're valid, right? You are beautiful just the way you are. When there's something very lovely about that. The problem is, right, is that we live in a world of limited resources, right? Medical diagnoses exist for a reason and have to be used to solve practical problems. And one of the things that we know for certain that's happening is that funding has been flowing out of the most severe cases of autism and towards the more, let's say, questionable cases. And not even questionable, let's not say that. Let's say the less severe cases on the spectrum over time. It's been well documented. And I just always say, like, the public just has a certain kind of bandwidth for understanding these things. And if they turn on their computer and what they see absolutely every day is someone who says that they're autistic, who is flourishing at Google after getting a degree at Stanford, and also is personable and charming and does get ready with me videos on TikTok, and if they've got everything going for them, it inevitably chips away at the public's perception that, like, hey, autism can be a really big deal. We need to devote resources in order to help people with it. And we need to maintain an understanding that for some people, this is really devastating.
So I think Freddie's point here is one that I would take. This is a real thing. Unfortunately, people do fake disorders. I'll put a link to a phenomena about a lot of teenage girls all of a sudden presenting with Tourette's syndrome because they saw influencers on TikTok with Tourette's that they wanted to imitate and mimic. And a lot of very concerned parents started bringing them to hospitals to get assessed because they're like, oh no, my daughter's developed Tourette's. And they didn't develop Tourette's. They just saw social media influencers and TikTok stars and Twitch streamers with Tourette's and just started mimicking them. This is a real phenomena. It actually happens. DID is one of them. Tourette's is one of them. Autism is one of them. I know a lot of people in the autistic community don't like to say that. This doesn't just happen with Tourette's and DID and autism, though. This happens with a lot of things. I have talked to many people who have actually pretended they were autistic when they were younger. So what happens? I have web scrapers, right? They go through, pull out all your comments, look for things saying, I'm autistic. So I'll find someone commenting on something, they're Christian or ex-Christian, and go through their comments. It'll pull out them saying, I'm autistic from 7 years ago. I'll send them a message and they'll be like, sorry, I thought that was like the best way to describe me, and it was sort of like a personal identity thing, and it was like a label I was playing around with. I was a teen and stupid, sorry, forgive me. And I'm like, oh, okay. So I've come across like in the triple digits cases of this, of just people who 6 or 7 years ago called themselves autistic on Tumblr or on Reddit, and then I come back being like, oh, that's so cool, do you want to be interviewed? And they're like, I'm not actually autistic. I do know that this happens. I'm not sure how much it happens. I wish I could give strong numbers, but like, this is a really difficult phenomenon to track. And it is mostly very young people who are a little confused, socially isolated, really want community, playing around with identities and identity labels. Like, we talk about the 5,000 gender thing on Tumblr, or like Mogai, that whole thing. That's mostly teenagers just trying to fit in, just trying to make sense of their confusing experience. A lot of them will discover autism and relate to some parts of it and start calling themselves autistic without deeply researching it. It happens. It's weird. As an autistic person, this seems bizarre. Like, why would you ever want to pretend to be like me? This freaking sucks. Right? Like, it doesn't make sense to a lot of us. So a lot of us think this wouldn't happen, but this is a social phenomenon that does happen. I don't know how much it happens, and I typically don't talk about it because this is mostly a trend I find annoying, not one that I think has much material impact. But as Freddie pointed out, like, it does have an impact, right? Because these are what the voices of what autism is start to sound like. And there are lots of cases like this. Another thing that Freddie talked about is autism communities are kind of a hug box, right? You call yourself autistic and you are met with people who just uncritically embrace you. And that's a very beautiful, loving thing. And a lot of lonely people are like, wait, I want to be cared for. I want to be unique. And no one's going to question you. No one in an autism community, I mean, except if you come into mine,
I was about to say,
will be like, I don't think that's autism. That's not really autism. Like, autism is a specific thing. Most autism communities don't do that. There is strong taboos over questioning diagnosis. There is an actual phenomena with this that has been frustrating my research attempts, at least in the past like 7 years. I started to see it a lot more starting in like 2018, and oh man, this is, yeah. So ASD 0 in Freddy's analysis is one thing. In my analysis, just being a guy deeply drowning in the autism sauce, I actually think it's like 4 different things, right? I think ASD 0, as Freddy calls it, is 4 distinct things. So one of them that he brings up is people who want sympathy and attention, who are in social spaces that socially incentivize identifying as autistic. This is a real phenomenon. I have run into it many times. It particularly happens in very specific demographics, typically adolescent girls and young women who spend a lot of time on TikTok and Instagram in socially progressive circles, often overlapping with queer adjacent and queer circles. If there is one group that false positives the most out of all of my analytics, it's that group, because in those groups, calling yourself autistic makes you sort of interesting, and you can take videos of yourself stimming and put them on TikTok, and lots of people will give you attention, and that feels cool and that feels good. I wish it didn't exist. It is deeply inconvenient to me and deeply inconvenient to my project because I frequently have to address these people and address this and then sort them out of my data, because it's like, okay, I've interviewed many of them. I've probably interviewed around 45 of them, and I don't include them in my formal interview set because I ask them things like, okay, what is autism? And they can't accurately explain it. They don't know what autism is. They know it's a cool label. And it is deeply frustrating because I see people with autism, one, like on the struggle bus, really having a hard time. And then there are these people who are like, oh, it means I'm like really interested in TV shows. And it's like, okay, that's not what autism is. There are clinical definitions of what autism is, and you are, to put it mildly, very subclinical. To
Words mean things.
Yes, to give a more concrete example from my life, my sister's friend group has all diagnosed themselves with autism spectrum disorder. My sister is the only one who comes close to meeting those criteria. I have met them, I have talked with them. I can't diagnose people, I can't undiagnose people. I am deeply embedded in this community. I know what autism looks like. I have talked to thousands of us. And I've talked to thousands of people who aren't, and thousands of people who are in overlapping communities like ADHD, bipolar, places like that. None of these people meet the criteria. However, they have been given an enormous amount of genuinely bad information about what autism is from consuming just poor grade information sources about autism and have not been curious enough to look it up online. So, one of the most common things that you see autistic people actually do in real life is when they hear about autism, they build a research binder. Like the most common thing that I see for autistic women, especially when someone mentions autism, they go into research mode. Like you said, they go to the library, they get every book, they read through every book, they create a detailed research notes binder about why they think they're autistic. They consume hundreds of hours of content to just try to figure this out. They go to clinical manuals, they talk to people, they seek out everything they can. I often find these people midway through their journey and provide them with resources. They consume all of them. There are groups of people who call themselves autistic who have done none of that work, whose entire conception of autism is what autism has been described to them in these social media spaces. And they have misperceptions of what autism actually is. And normally I just think these people are annoying, and like it makes it harder to deal with because I
And
do
also
research.
very young. They're often very
Yes,
young.
yes, they are all like under the age of 25, and they are all from socially progressive activist communities. This, luckily, I work with Christianity. My population is Christianity. Most people in my population do not belong to any of these groups. And if you are a Christian, you probably know that calling yourself autistic is negatively socially incentivized to a huge degree. So this isn't a problem I actually deal with an enormous amount because of all these negative social incentives. But it is still something that I deal with. It is still something that I have to deal with in this population group that I shouldn't have to be dealing with it because there is so much negative social incentive, but it still happens. And I know tangentially just from looking for controls that this does happen. And unfortunately, these people create TikTok accounts where they contribute to the spread of misinformation about what autism is because they go, I'm autistic, so everything I do must be autistic. And they make listicles of 10 signs you might be autistic. And they're like, sometimes you get tired at parties. You don't like when people stab you. like sometimes when you fall over and hit your head hurts. It's like, this is not autism. You are not describing autism. But unfortunately, they center themselves, right? And they build large platforms and they get lots of clout on social media for it because autism in some circles gives you clout. So I think that's one category.
Yes, I believe this. I find it mystifying because I do not think I am in any
Yes.
social circle where I would get more clout for being autistic.
It is a deeply weird phenomenon to me. Yeah, the second part are just like people who have subclinical levels or are in adjacent communities who have multiple co-occurring things, like they have anxiety disorder, they are gifted, they have depressive disorder, they have ADHD. So they have this perfect storm of other combinations of things that look a lot like autism but aren't quite autism.
I would think that would be especially true if you add complex PTSD.
Yes, yeah, and other things like that. Like, this is not an exhaustive list. Who have all these things and they read stuff about autism and they're like, this might not fit entirely, but it certainly rhymes. And so you have these people, and then, those people I don't really begrudge much because it's like, yeah, that's fair. Like, these people commonly false positive in my data sets. and then they go to get diagnosed, and they're like, the diagnostician actually takes their time and does a proper assessment and goes, okay, autism might not be the best way to describe this. Oftentimes those diagnosticians false negative as well. It still
I
could be
mean,
that they're autistic, but like there are, and I will happily acknowledge, there are many edge cases or people who have like subclinical levels. I know of several autism influencers who have tried to get diagnosed, did not get diagnosed, and then shopped to various different doctors and therapists. This has happened more than once. I've tracked it more than once for prominent autism influencers. They have personally DM'd me, or I have personally DM'd them. They're like, I didn't get diagnosed. Why didn't I get diagnosed? And they then go to like 4 different doctors, and on the 4th one, they get diagnosed. And it's like, that probably was not.
well,
There's a
and
reason you had to go to 4.
my experience, I didn't realize that my kid was even really in an autism evaluation. It was just a general neuropsych. I think I thought we were looking for ADHD. And so when I went across, my kid would only agree to get an evaluation if I got one too, which seemed fair. It seemed fair and my insurance cooperated. So why not? But the guy who did my initial evaluation, I said, "Oh, and my kid's doctor mentioned autism, but I don't know much about that. So I just thought I'd mention it to you as well as the ADHD." He pulled down the DSM, glanced through it, and said, "No, you have a job where you work with people, and you seem comfortable enough in here right now. So that's not you." And so there are assessors who just don't know what they're doing. I think that's a legitimate concern, because then 2 different doctors after that, when I brought up, "Oh, I have a new ADHD diagnosis," they said, "And autism?" And I said, "What?" And so both, like 2 different neurologists and a neurologist and a neuropsychologist both said, "Oh, that man just doesn't understand autism in women." And so I think especially for women or for people who are particularly high masking, it is an issue that some assessors don't have a framework for that. Unless you are a 9-year-old boy talking about trains, they might not understand it. However, if you're on your 5th person and you still haven't found somebody, that's a different issue.
Yeah, so I want to be really clear. Second opinions are valid and useful because misdiagnosis happens all the time. Second opinions for every single medical condition are useful and necessary. I'm not saying getting a second opinion is bad and you have to go with your first one. After getting diagnosed with autism, I showed up to my 73-year-old doctor to try to get on medication for depression, and I said, also, I have Asperger's syndrome, and he said, no, you don't. And I had met him for 2 minutes, so he did not know me at all. This was my first appointment with him. I said, I have Asperger's syndrome as well. He said, no, you don't. So this does
I think
happen.
experiences like that are common enough that it makes
Yeah,
sense to me that people get very defensive.
yeah, yeah. But on your 4th one, like when you get to your 4th doctor saying no, or if you go to a very experienced doctor who has the relevant background, and then like if you go to an autism specialist and the autism specialist comes back to you and says no, not really, or maybe you do, or if they straight up just say no, then that's like completely different. Anyway, so I think subclinical borderline cases, another factor is people just memeing. This has been a constant bane of my existence. I know this happens all the time because people will say, I'm autistic or something, and my detection algorithms will catch them and then send them an automated message like, hey, I noticed you're Christian or ex-Christian and autistic. I'm an independent researcher doing all this, blah, 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 blah. Do you want to be interviewed? And they'll be like, oh, I was just memeing, sorry. That does happen. People using autism as a replacement word for socially awkward, anxious, weird, or obsessive does happen all the time. And this gives people misperceptions about autism. Like, autism has, in many circles, become a replacement for many pejorative words for intellectual disability that I will not repeat on this podcast. But
Thank you.
in many cases, that is the case. And so there are people that would, I think, Freddy would classify as ASD0 who are just memeing, who are just like using it as a pejorative, but not really thinking about the implications for what this means for policy and medical treatment and the context of neurodiversity that it's feeding into. And then there's another big one. I think this is probably a large portion of people that Freddy identifies as ASD0, which is people who actually have ASD1 who are literally just coping and posting through it. I think that is actually a big portion. So to explain this phenomenon to people, when you get diagnosed, especially if you get diagnosed as an adult, there's nothing for you. Like, you usually get a diagnosis and get kicked out the door, and you go, what the hell am I supposed to do? Obviously, the first thing you do is you go on the internet and you go and you search autism women over 35, right? Or you go to your library and get books, and you will find two classes of books. One, books written for parents for ASD3 that are like, autism is a curse from God meant to destroy you and your marriage. White knuckle through this, like, prepare to die and to be in misery for the rest of your life. Also, try get your kid to drink bleach. Maybe that'll help. That's
Oh,
almost a joke. Like,
it's really
obviously,
not.
I'm satirizing this, but that is very close to what you will actually find. And then the second class of resources is neurodiversity resources. So your Devon Prices, Unmasking Autism, your neurodiversity, yay books. And these are like, hey, actually, you do have this issue. It's very common. Here is language to talk about that. And the only game in town to talk about and describe autism, with the exception of clinical manuals, is neurodiversity. And so people immediately go, oh, this is how I'm supposed to think about my disability. This is how I'm supposed to think about this thing that I have now. This is the language I should use to talk about it. Oh, I'm in this community. I'm used to being an outsider. I'm used to being a weirdo. And there's all these groups of people who will now embrace me. And we can talk about how we love our stims and how this isn't bad and things like that. And a lot of them are just new to autism, haven't thought about it too deeply, and have been basically given this language. And we've talked about this a lot. Autistic people often tend to be really bad at self-expressing, and so we will use other people's words to self-express. And whose words are we given? Neurodiversity activists, who are typically really against negatively describing autistic experiences.
Yeah.
If you have ASD1 and you are newly diagnosed, you will probably look like the people that Freddy is describing who have ASD0, because you just don't have the equipment necessary to explain that you're not having a good time, and that there are actually lots of difficulties and problems here. Since I made my RFK episode, like the second half, I basically just said, look, I don't like having autism. I don't like feeling like this. I've got like 15 messages from people being like, thank you for saying this. I didn't know I was allowed to feel this way. And so, like, I think a lot of ASD0 talk of there's nothing wrong with me, there's nothing bad about me, is literally just cope from people who have been given a set of tools to express themselves, and a set of tools to express themselves in a way that I feel is genuinely unhelpful.
And for your audience, where they're much more likely, I say they, I mean we, are much more likely to have grown up in like downstream of theologies that you have talked about in earlier episodes, like your Eleanor Stumps and and I'm forgetting who else, but people who do
Andrew
see
Pinsent.
autism. Yes, people who see autism as outside of the image of God or use it as a metaphor for separation from God. I understand swinging hard the other direction as a way of figuring out, wait, these things that I internalized as a young person are not true. So what else, what could be true? And you start looking around for what is true. I would say if you are the person who, like me, is the, I don't know, late diagnosed 30 something digging through the library trying to find the books, the best book that I found that is not in either of these categories is called Is This Autism? A Guide for Clinicians and Everyone Else. It's by Donna Henderson, Sarah Wayland, and Jamel White. It's kind of an expensive book to just buy, but if your library has it, that is it is the most descriptive of both strengths and weaknesses and of a variety of parts of the spectrum. And especially what I found helpful. So I don't think of, maybe this is because I was diagnosed so late. I don't think of autism as the hard part for me. The parts I think of as the hard parts, I thought of always as just like unrelated things that just keep happening to me. That from reading Is This Autism? I learned are highly correlated with autism. Things like hypermobility that has caused me premature arthritis, things like dysautonomia and PCOS and migraines. I think of those as the hard parts, and I don't think of autism as the hard part. However, it is very common for autistic women to have some combination of those things. So, is that autism? I don't know, but it sure goes with autism. And those parts are categorically disabling for me.
Yeah. And like, this is Freddie's point here is that this ASD0 phenomena is deeply unhelpful for helping autistic people because the way that it frames things doesn't frame it in a way that is helpful, because when you talk about these things without talking about negatives, without talking about these issues, and it's only a good thing, it doesn't need treatment. It doesn't need, like, I mean, my issue with the cure for autism is, like, I don't even know what that means. Like, it's a very ambiguous term when I'm not sure what you're talking about. But treatment, yeah, that's good. You should get
And a
treatment for
huge
this. This really sucks.
and even
And
though, yes, I am late diagnosed, so there's nothing for me, knowing that there are a lot of co-occurring conditions with autism better equips me to access the medical care I need. It helps me communicate better with my doctors. It helps me get the accommodations I need so that I don't get unnecessarily more injured. I don't know that I would have those tools without a diagnosis of something that if I were making front-facing camera content, someone might clock as level 0 autism.
yeah, and I think level 0 autism is basically just talking about autism in deeply unhelpful ways. Like, what he's describing as level 0 autism isn't like one thing. It is a constellation of things that turns into talking about autism in ways that are deeply unhelpful. And I think that is the best way to characterize it. I tend to see this as something that I find annoying, but not really a bigger problem. But Freddie disagrees with that, and he sort of goes into why he thinks this is an actual problem. And so we'll play that.
Yeah, I mean, look, like I would like so to sort of to connect it to mental illness again. It's like, I mean, it's particularly acute in autism, right? This problem that the most severe people like literally cannot speak for themselves, right? And so they can't like advocate for why their problem is so important, you know. And so what happens is that because the people who are the the least severely afflicted are also the ones who have like literally the most ability to speak, like number one can communicate, but also number two like have platforms, right, and know how to navigate social media and stuff like that. Inevitably the skew is always in their direction, even when everybody's sort of working with good intentions, right? The world, I mean, I like I generally stay really far away from sort of mental illness advocacy stuff online because it drives me crazy. And one of the things that drives me most, I guess that's a bad choice of terms, it makes me upset, is it's absolutely obsessive focus on stigma, right? Meaning like the problem, like, to listen to so many of the major sort of voices in this space, to go into these forums on Reddit or Twitter or Tumblr or wherever, you would think that the like if someone has a severe schizophrenia, their biggest problem is stigma, meaning that other people are mean to them for having schizophrenia. When in fact, anyone who's got a really severe psychotic disorder, I promise, like stigma is not in their top 100 problems. Okay, like they have real problems, right? And yeah, and there's just that's sort of a problem from hell for me in terms of like the way that modern communication and cultural discourse happens, right? I don't know how you sort of get out of that sort of thing. And then you add on top of that the concept of standpoint theory, which for those listening who don't know, standpoint theory is just the idea like nothing about us without us, etc., like where the only people who should be able to speak on an issue are people who suffer from that issue, which has become very prominent in autism circles. But again, the severely autistic, the non-communicatively autistic, definitionally cannot speak. And so you would like to sort of nominate their family members, their parents and their family members and their friends as advocates for them. But a lot of people in the activist class really don't like that, and they routinely sort of dismiss and poo the experience of the family members. I did a podcast. In fact, this was sort of one of the things that most inspired that initial gentrification of disability post that I wrote, which is I did a podcast with these three women. They have been doing a podcast for years. They're the mothers of adult children with schizophrenia. And these are women, they're all now, I guess, technically senior citizens. They have adult sons who have serious schizophrenia, and they've been fighting for decades to keep their kids alive and to keep their kids from being institutionalized long term. And I just went on this show, and they were you just interact with them, and you can just feel the exhaustion sort of coming off of them from having to do this for so long. And one of the things that they said to me was like, we're so glad to have you on our show because we can't talk about a lot of this stuff. And I said, what do you mean you can't talk about it? And they said, we don't have schizophrenia. We don't have a psychotic disorder. So, we're not really allowed to talk about it. And I said that there is something deeply wrong, right? Where someone can say, okay, I have anxiety, so therefore I have a mental illness. So therefore I can go on TikTok and I can speak with total authority and total confidence about what it means to be mentally ill. But these mothers who have kept these kids alive for 30 years, right, struggling with one of the most devastating conditions that you can possibly struggle with, they're not allowed to have a voice. And so I just find the communicative landscape just really depressing. I don't really know how you get out of it under current circumstances.
So Freddie's whole point, I think, is that in such a broad condition, such as ASD, like, there is almost no overlap between the needs of ASD 1, 2, and 3. And the least affected people within ASD 1, even with good intentions, inevitably recenter the discourse around them and their needs, and they become the main voice, even when they don't mean to. Like, even if they have great intentions from the start, have been like, we're doing this and we're doing this right, will inevitably turn back on them because there's this idea. He talks about standpoint theory, like, in order to talk about autism, the only thing you need is to be autistic. And I have pointed out many times, autistic people have really weird and skewed intuitions about what autism is that are heavily shaped by the autistic people around them. Talk to autistic people in conservative churches. What autism is a very, very different thing than autistic people in progressive churches. What autism is and what autistic people are like changes wildly based on the community. And the only way to get a good perspective of this is to do in-depth, broad-scale ethnographic analysis. And there's no escaping that, right? Your experience of autism is not actually sufficient to understand autism, and your experience of the autism community is not the experience of the autism community. It is an experience of a small slice of the autism community. And it leads to issues where you think that what autism is what you experience and the types of autism that you see around you. But these are self-selected communities, and you are dealing with one of the worst cases of survivorship bias when you define this way. And so regardless, your best good faith attempts to talk about autism from these perspectives inevitably fail and will end up centering you and other people like you. And especially when you're dealing with a broad spectrum condition where some people literally cannot speak for themselves, this means that they will inevitably center themselves because they are not being like, okay, we need a broad spectrum approach. We need to see this as a whole thing. And then we need to triage and sort and prioritize. And we need to decenter ourselves and center the people who need the most help. And that is not a fun thing to do, especially when you are suffering with legitimate needs and legitimate concerns.
I also think that there are some real practical issues around saying only someone with this disability can speak about it and advocate for it, because those of us with this disability are really tired. Really tired. So there is one Instagram account I follow by an autistic mom with a very different experience, rather an autism mom with very different experience than I do. Not only does her kid have much higher support needs than my kid, But also, as far as I know, she herself is not autistic. If she is, I haven't seen it anywhere. And a different theological background. So she's working mostly in like a non-denominational or Southern Baptist kind of context, which is very different from my theology and my denominational background. Her name is Lara Roberts. And she seems like she is extremely helpful for people with whose families are similar to hers. And even though I will read some of her stuff and I'll say, oh, this does not apply to us at all, or this is maybe the opposite of what I would think, I also know she's not talking to me. She's talking to a different part of the autism community. But one thing that I saw her say the other day is that a common experience that parents of disabled kids have in church is they will say, hey, we need some more supports for our kids. And the church will say, great, start a ministry. The parents of these kids do not have the energy to start the ministry. And the analogy she gave was that we actually might be driven enough and might be in enough of a crisis that we will start the ministry, but we can only start it like a match. We are going to burn out fast. Someone has to take this from us. Ideally, someone who is not in the same constant trenches we are and is not the same level of exhausted we are to support us. We cannot only be relying on other families with the same difficulties we have. We need people who don't have these difficulties to come and be on the team.
Yeah, and I would also add to that, like, I know many autism researchers who themselves don't have autism, and they understand autism way better than I would say 95% of autistic people that I know. Like, they
Well,
actually understand what's going on better than most people with autism do because they're
Catherine
researchers and
Tan
they're good.
is not
Yes.
autistic. Catherine Tan is not autistic. Van Omen, who wrote Autism and Worship, which I find a useful book to help like my not autistic friends understand autism in a theological context. He's not autistic.
Tony Atwood, who wrote The Complete Guide to Asperger's Syndrome, not autistic. Brilliant book. Excellent stuff in there. Most of the clinicians I know are not autistic, but also specialists in autism. Like, you don't actually need personal experience to think about this. And often personal experience can actually be an impediment to your understanding because you're constantly thinking about your experience. And like, speaking as an autism researcher, I frequently have to remove my own experience from the context and just listen to people and what they say. The idea that only autistic people can talk about autism and can recommend policies and do analysis and advocate for policies is wrong. I get that a lot of autistic people, like, I know why we say nothing about us without us, because a lot of earlier autism policy has been garbage and has not treated us like humans, ASD1 included. Like, a lot of ASD1 interventions early on were really bad because they didn't talk to autistic people. But that isn't because there was a lack of autistic people. That's because the methods were bad. Like, they sucked, and they would be bad for any other place. And while I'm not saying, I definitely think autistic people should be involved. They should have a voice. They should have a voice, though, not the voice.
And I will say that in all of that, I would agree with. And I would also say, in my personal experience trying to navigate supports for myself and my kids, the best predictor of a therapist or a doctor being extremely helpful to us and understanding us is that they are either autistic or ADHD, because those are the two things we have in our family. So it's also like, yeah, we need some people who are not autistic, who are experts, who are on the team. And also, it is it has been very beneficial to my house to have a neurologist who's also autistic and a therapist who is also ADHD. Like, that's been extremely useful.
Yeah, so autistic people are often very, like, some of the best researchers I know are also autistic. It is not being autistic, though, that makes them really good researchers. It is all these other, like, thorough, diligent things that they apply combined with them being autistic.
They have
And
harnessed their autism
yes,
in a particular direction. It doesn't
yeah,
mean that every autistic person would be equally qualified to do
yes.
this.
And it also doesn't mean that people who aren't autistic can't do this. Like, The parents of autistic people, I think, are important voices. They get a lot of things wrong. I don't think these communities are perfect or beyond critique by any means. A lot of them go down really weird rabbit holes, and it's deeply unhelpful. Finally, one of the things that Freddie talks about is stigma, and I think it's just important to emphasize. I think his concern is mostly correct. Like, stigma, in terms of triage priorities, is pretty low down on the list, with one exception, and that I would say kids and teens. Kids and teens, stigma is very high on the list. Stigma does affect your willingness to access treatment, your willingness to get help, those types of things. Stigma absolutely does affect it, but if that is your only problem, you're doing pretty well. Is basically what it comes down to it. And I asked Freddie more about that, and here he is sort of trying to explain what he means by that and why he thinks that the discourse around neurodiversity and autism are actually kind of damaging. So we'll play that here.
But it's also, I mean, look, like, I really think we should drill down into this because I think that this is super important, right? I'm a really big believer in the Americans with Disabilities Act, right? It's flawed like anything else is, but it is one of the best things this country has ever done. And, and by the way, signed by a Republican president, by the way, carved out of, the country when these rights did not exist. We defined rights for people with disabilities and said, hey, look, people with disabilities that are hindrances that keep them from living lives as fully and as comfortably and as happily as they could. We as a society should make a commitment to say that we will provide every reasonable accommodation, right, for people with disabilities in order to make them live better lives. And, reasonable accommodation is kind of an elegant standard, even though it's necessarily vague, right? Because it says that, like, there's always going to be some things we can't accommodate. Blind people can't be fighter pilots, but we can accommodate a lot of things. And that, there is a real, like, very, like, I don't know, pleasing logic to say, hey, some people are in wheelchairs, so we're going to build ramps, right? Some people can't get upstairs, so we're going to build elevators, right? Some people can't see, so we're going to put braille signage up, right? Things like that. Some people can't hear, so we're going to have closed captions, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, right? And then there's even with ones that tend to be a little bit more controversial and get a little bit stickier, still, the concept is very valid, which is like, okay, some people have, cognitive or developmental disabilities that make it harder for them to do academic work, so they get more time on tests, etc. The whole logic stems from the idea that something is a hindrance to you. You have a disability. There's an ability that most people have. You don't have that ability. You have a disability. So we are going to accommodate it, right? I don't understand what the moral case is for disability accommodations for people who say that they are autistic and define it as a disability, but deny that it has any harm or negative to them, right? Like, I don't get the basic moral logic.
Yeah, and so I agree with him. Like, I think reasonable accommodation is essential for autistic people. Reasonable accommodation is essential for the functioning of people with ASD 1, 2, and 3. And I think his point that, like, in order to be accommodated, you need to acknowledge that something is wrong. You need to acknowledge that something needs to be addressed, and, like, there is a problem here that needs to be fixed. And if you don't like the framing of the word problem or whatever, this is semantics. This is a language game we're playing, and this is kind of a stupid language game that they're playing that has really no effect on materiality. And I cannot be convinced that this actually has a significant effect from all the research that I've been doing. Like, language plays a very insignificant role in things, and it often leads to things just. I find in the neurodiversity community, sometimes we end up doing like wild language gymnastics to express the term deficit without saying the term deficit. And it'd be a lot easier if we just said deficit. It'd be a lot easier if we just said disorder, because that's really what we're talking about. It's 95% of the way there. But we're doing like these enormous backward handsprings and like double twists to get the words exactly right so that we don't say something with a negative valence, but express what to most people they would just say is something negative that often,
Well,
I think, causes problems.
and sometimes the way that they'll reframe the problem, I wouldn't disagree with. They'll say, if you are a wheelchair user and the building doesn't have ramps, it has, or elevators, it only has stairs, then is that a problem with you or the structure of the building? And like the answer is both,
Both.
but it's both. But if the building does get ramps and elevators, that the a point that they make that I think is useful is that doesn't only help the people who use wheelchairs. It also helps the people who have strollers and rolling luggage and maybe are have a back problem that you can't see. And so, though having those accommodations available, even for people who don't look like they need them, you can't always tell what they need. Similar to my kids' teacher, again, this is about kids, having the headphones are for everybody. Anybody who needs the headphones. The flexible seating is for everybody. It's not for only my kids. If it were for only my kids would never use it, even though they desperately need it.
Totally agree with you. But how do we force people to make those accommodations who don't want to make those accommodations, right? Like buildings and building companies don't want to put in wheelchair ramps. They don't want to put in elevator access. And there is this class of people in our society who are people with disabilities. And people with disabilities need accommodation. And if there's nothing wrong with the person, they don't need accommodation. And so his whole point is that, right, you can frame it like that. But in terms of forcing the arm of government to implement these things and actually get material effects, the logic that we operate on is there are some people who just have it worse than other people. And those people who have it worse need reasonable accommodation and should be provided with reasonable accommodation. Because, this happens all the time in autism discourse, and it drives me up the wall, where the logic of reasonable accommodation gets sidelined for the logic of feelings and the logic of interpersonal subjective preferences for aesthetics. And it is a deeply frustrating thing to see where a person will reject the framing of, I don't have a disability, I have a difference. And it's like, good. We don't need to accommodate a difference then. I think that's his big concern. Like, there's a really frustrating dialogue in neurodiversity communities that I am constantly having, which is they will talk about accommodation has failed. We don't need accommodation. We need liberation. And it's like, cool radical language, bro. But like, what does that mean? So in the liberation theology book that we reviewed, Claire Williams says, accommodation and aid have failed. We don't want that. We want liberation. It's like, no, we mostly want accommodation.
I had a G.K. Chesterton response to that, which is, he said it about Christianity. Has Christianity been tried and found difficult, or has it been found difficult and therefore not tried? And I think of this about some of the accommodations. It's like, what has it failed, or have we done a bad job implementing it?
Yeah. And like, I talk to lots of people with ASD1 who are really struggling, who need accommodation. And here's a list of their top priorities. You will notice a theme here: employment support, employment accommodation, workplace accommodation, ability to get a job, and to have protections within that job so they don't get fired for being weird. And they have bosses and managers who will understand them, who will not overtly discriminate against them because they have this social disability.
I see
That's the biggest
analogous
one.
thing. I see analogous things of parents of kids with very similar diagnoses to my kids who are in different school systems than my kids are, who are fighting to keep their kid from getting expelled. They're because the school has, yes, they have this list of accommodations. They haven't actually really done them. And then they say they failed and they want to get rid of the kid instead. Those kids need the protection to stay in to get an education.
Yep. And so like that is the biggest thing that they always cite is employment accommodation. because they need jobs to make money so they don't go homeless and so they can feed themselves. That is what they
Yep.
need.
In my circles, people are using that same language to talk about education support for their kids, and
Yep.
it's analogous. It's very similar.
Yep. Second point, housing support. So, ability to, if you can't get a job and if you can't stay employed in like a standard 40-hour work week, subsidized housing for people who have disabilities, or the ability to live in an assisted facility where you have access to like a social worker and things like that. That's the second one, is employment support, then housing support. And then the third one is service accessibility. So access to a social worker, access to someone who can help you. A lot of issues with complex social tasks, like I need a driver's license, but I can't go to the DMV. I can't go to the place I need to go. I can't schedule my appointments. I don't understand these things. I just need someone to be beside me to do these things with me.
To help with the executive function
Yes.
part,
Yeah,
you can't put in a wheelchair ramp for executive function. You need another
exactly.
person helping you.
Yep. And so like getting his driver's license, paying bills, going to stores, getting appointments, like booking dentist appointments and making sure someone is there to help you get there. Like public transit is another really big one. Effective, reliable public transit. Because a lot of them don't have driver's licenses and never will get a driver's license and can't get a driver's license because they're autistic and they have all these issues around it. Like the only reason I don't need access to these supports is because like my family jokes that I married my social worker. Like I married a nurse. She is a wonderful woman with amazing executive function. But like that's why I don't need these support services, because I have my wife who can do these things for me. And like she's fine with doing it and she's not getting burnt out. But a lot of spouses of autistic people are wildly burnt out by this. There's a lot of care work that needs to be done if your spouse has autism. That might not get done. And if it doesn't get done, they're going to start flailing and floundering. And so they need supports for these types of things. You'll notice none of those things are really stigma. All of those
No.
things are specific policy things that need to be like actually addressed for helping people with ASD1. Does stigma affect things like employment discrimination? Sure. Absolutely will have some effect. However, the biggest problem isn't the stigma. The problem is the material response of employers within a legal framework who will fire you because you're weird. Which is more likely? We are going to create a world in which people don't think that guys with ASD1 are weird, or a framework in which you say, I know they're weird, you're not allowed to fire them for being weird. Like, which are we more likely to get? And maybe this is just me being a massive pessimist, but I don't see a world in which stigma for autism won't exist. We are just weird people. We exist weirdly. We are a small minority of the population. So non autistic people's reference point for normal behavior will never be us. This seems sort of naively utopian, and we can actually achieve realistic goals and realistic ends right now by like focusing on these things. And employment support won't just help autistic people, it will help lots of other people with lots of other accommodations and support needs. And so you could actually build broad-based coalitions around disability support in these places. But you can't do that if you say there's nothing actually wrong with autism.
Yeah.
And so, like, I think that's really Freddy's whole thing here. And, like, this sort of brings it back into this discourse around, like, there's nothing wrong with us and there's nothing bad about it. Freddy has a lot of thoughts about that. So we'll play this clip here.
Yeah, like it's like I mean, you mentioned the superhero thing, right? Superpower thing, and I more, I don't mean to be pedantic with people, but I say, okay, what would it mean to accommodate a superpower? Like what? You know what I'm saying? Like you wouldn't see Superman. You wouldn't see Superman and say, look at all the powers he's got. We need to provide him with accommodation. And this is like I ask people very specifically, okay, if this is only good and only positive in your life. What do you need accommodation for? But I guess it gets to this, like, I mean, like you just said, you can't tell people that suffering is involved with this because we just have an absolute refusal to accept that some things in life are just bad. Like this comes down to a lot of things. I mean, I say it all the time. I cannot tell you because, I mean, I've been in institutions a bunch, and I've been in group therapy, and I've been in a bunch of support groups and things like that. And part of the reason why I don't do like, mental bipolar culture or mental illness online culture is just that it's like, I cannot tell you how many times I have been told that like my psychotic disorder is my superpower. And I say to people like, look, this thing has ruined my life ever since I was 20 years old. Like, I have a roster of friends and relationships that are gone, that I ruined, where people just finally made the entirely fair and correct decision to just never interact with me ever again because I was so abusive because of, the influence of my disorder. My professional life is so much worse than it could be if it wasn't for this thing. I mean, I cannot begin to tell you the amount of regret I have over this. And I have absolutely zero interest in wrapping it up into some narrative that's like ultimately meant to please you. I mean, this is the thing that I tell people all the time, right? It's like, when you tell me that I should have positive feelings about this, that I should see it as like my superpower, or that it's like this wonderful part of me, and because it comes from me, it must be good. I always tell people, that's something I would say to please you. Like, that's not something that pleases me. That doesn't help me. That's just to make you feel better about about my life. And I've actually just been working on a piece about this theme, which is just like something about modern social justice and activist cultures makes it impossible for them to comprehend the possibility that some things in life just suck, and because they suck, we build systems to help people when they suck, right? Which is like, if I go and I commit a crime while I am manic, right, I will at least receive some amount of accommodation from the prosecutors, right, like, or from the court system, to address the fact that I was acting under the influence of my disorder. And that's something that I need, right? I don't intend to ever go off meds again, but if I did, right, and I get arrested again, then the system has some sense of accommodation for a bad thing, right? And they're not like, once you invoke this notion that like, hey, it's all good, it's just, it's like, it's all this positive stuff, then the sort of the protection that sort of accrues to me from having this disorder, the logic behind it falls away. And I think that like people are far too cavalier with sort of undermining the basic logic of accommodation of the Americans with Disabilities Act. And ultimately, like, look, like, I just think that, like I said at the beginning, like, so there's a guy, I can't remember his name. He just had a piece in the New York Times a month or so ago. He is super well-respected scientist. I think that he is literally the editor of the journal Science, and he wrote a piece about the rise in autism diagnoses in the New York Times, and I wrote him a critical email. He wrote me back, which was nice, and we had a little back and forth. But, as I said to him, I mean, he said, like, these things should not be together either, right? Like he said, after writing this piece that's very much in the sort of neurodiversity sort of tradition, and he said, oh, no, you know what? It doesn't make sense for a kid who lives in a basement and has to wear a harness because if he doesn't, he's going to claw his eyes out and will never speak and will never have a job and will never be in love, etc. There's just no reason for that to be the same diagnosis as someone who goes to Yale. And, I get that all the time even from people who really don't like what I have to say about these things, that it doesn't make sense to roll these things into one. But it was activist pressure. Had played a really big part in the DSM getting rid of Asperger's. The fact that the guy whose name was on it was a Nazi is a very stupid reason to make any kind of diagnostic change, but that absolutely played a part in it. And it does seem like there could be some momentum for like saying, okay, what can we do to sort of separate these things out again so that it just makes a little more sense? I mean, I think that, I always tell people, like, for me, the worst case scenario was this incident at Harvard where in 2022, there's a conference going on and about autism and neurodiversity, and there's a panel that, like, just literally the only thing about it was that the panelists were talking about treatment, right? Like treatment for autism. And a bunch of autism activists, student activists at Harvard freaked out, and they had a huge fit, and they got the panel shut down. And they decried it as violently ableist because to speak of treatment, right, is to imply that there's something wrong with autism. And it's just like, you just want to grab these kids by the collar and say, listen, asshole, like, I'm thrilled for you that as an autistic person, you've made it to Harvard University. Okay. That's lovely for you. But again, there are millions of people in this country who have autism so severe that they're never going to live a conventional life at all. And maybe you could put yourself aside for a little while. But I think the only way that happens is if the diagnosis gets split again, because people are so possessive over the diagnosis.
So I think that just sometimes things suck and are bad, and there isn't really a silver lining to these things. Like I've said before, this is not the message you give to an 8-year-old who's really struggling. But this is a message, like, at a certain point, you stop being an 8-year-old. Like, you start being an adult, and you just have to reckon with, actually, I kind of got dealt a bad hand. I wish I didn't, but I did. And now I just have to deal with this. And sometimes things just suck. Now, a lot of the autistic community has been trying really hard to push back at the superpower discourse. I will say this. Neurodiversity movement has shifted away from the superpower discourse, started in like 2018 when people really started to push against it. And now I would say in those past 7 years, the superpower way of talking about autism is no longer there. However, I will say, despite the superficial disavowal of superpower discourse, it is still there. It is still under the surface. It's just not called that. I often joke that there is a brand of neurodiversity activism that is not superpowers, but superpower for social justice. So autistic people, we have this morally superior sense of understanding the world. We see things for how they really are. I don't have a disability. I just see systemic injustice. Great message if you're talking to an 8-year-old. Not cute when you're 22.
There
Yeah.
was a book that it's fiction, and Cloud Cuckoo Land. It was very popular for a while. I don't know if it still is. I have a controversial take of not loving this book, but one of the main characters is autistic, and his name is Seymour because he sees more, and I just wanted to hide in a hole. I was like, this is brutal. And this is never commented on in the book, but to me, it was beating me over the head. This is a year or two pre-autism diagnosis for me, and it was still beating me over the head with that his name is Seymour, and he just notices more things than other people do. But when I've discussed it with other people who've read the book, they didn't notice that. They didn't notice that his name was Seymour. But it did play into this, like, yeah, this guy is super observant, kind of you end up with in pop culture characters that are kind of Sherlocky, right?
Yep. And to be fair, this does describe a certain subset of autistic people. I fall into this category. A lot of the guys I work with fall into this category where we are incredibly gifted computer engineers. This is not at all representative of the autism community. I'm an outlier. Most of the guys I work with, we are all weird outliers in what actually encompasses autism. A lot of guys have PhDs, cannot get employed, cannot keep a job for more than 3 months because they immediately burn out or they get stressed out. They can't hold employment in their fields. They can only work part-time because of their autism. And it's like, okay, you were smart enough to get a PhD, but you can't hold down a junior lecturer position. I wouldn't call that a superpower. I would call that a disability. And it's something that needs accommodation. And unfortunately, although there has been a superficial disavowal of the superpower discourse, it is just switched its name. The language has just shifted, but very much in the neurodiversity community, there is this overemphasis on here's what autism really is, or like autistic people, we aren't bad, we're different. And for me, it was just very cathartic to be like, actually, no, this sucks. And again, I'm one of the lucky ones. I am 1% of the autistic population. I shouldn't be prioritized in discourse. And I get viciously attacked by the neurodiversity community. I get called a eugenicist, I get called an ableist, I get called all these things because I just try to speak plainly about autism and communicate autism effectively to non-autistic people and to autistic people. I say things like autism spectrum disorder because I think that's an accurate description of what it is, and it's what it's called in the DSM. I will say we have communication deficits because a deficit is when you take a general ability in the population and you map its effectiveness. And when you look at autistic people, we are just worse at communicating. People will say, but the double empathy problem. The double empathy problem is a useful conceptual model. It's not an actual phenomenon. It is a useful conceptual model for describing asymmetrical expectations of communication, where non-autistic people do not have to accommodate autistic people, but autistic people have to accommodate non-autistic people because we're like 2-3% of the population. Right? We are a very small fraction. But saying communication deficits gets you attacked because we can't have deficits. That's a morally bad thing. It's like, no, this isn't a morally bad thing. This is a plain description. You are saying it's morally bad. And it's like, this is, I don't know. I experience autism as a disabling thing. And like I say, autistic people are bad at this. I get jumped by the community for saying we're bad at this. And it's just like, this is a plain statement of fact. Why are we tying ourselves into pretzels to try to reinforce this idea that there isn't anything bad or anything wrong? Sometimes things just suck. And for me, autism is just one of those things that sucks. I don't know how
And I
else to
do
put
think,
it, because autism is a neurodevelopmental condition that starts when you're very young and your brain responds to socialization within the context of autism from the start. And so it's like, who would I be? Maybe I'd be like my siblings. Actually, I'd kind of like to be a lot more like my siblings than like me, because holy crap, this sucks. But I don't like being autistic. I don't have fun being autistic. It's fine to say that. I mean, I wouldn't tell that to a child, right? I think the neurodiversity framework is absolutely what you should use to talk to children about autism, to be like, you're not disabled, you're just different, because that's what they need to hear. But now, as a 30-year-old man, I'm kind of just like, yeah, this sucks. I don't like it. And I spent so long agonizing over trying to square this circle of the neurodiversity framework of what I was experiencing and what I was seeing people experience. I like trying not to call it bad, trying not to say it's negative, and it's just like, this is, I don't know. Let's call a spade a spade. Let's just acknowledge this isn't fun and this isn't cool and I don't like being like this. If you do, I'm super happy for you. I am glad that this doesn't affect you in a way that you'd want to make it go away.
and
But
like when I'm
I
thinking
do,
about
and a lot of
when
people
I'm,
do.
when I'm thinking about my role as a parent and how neurodiversity is useful or not to me and to my kids, like, yeah, we definitely work from this framework. Their teachers work from this framework. That is what gets them their accommodations. If it were the medical framework that would help me get them their accommodations, I would probably pivot to that. But I'm going to do whatever I need to do to get them their accommodations, to give them an education, to help them, and have the skills they need to navigate the world, to have friends, to express when they're in pain in a way that is safe for them and for other people, and they can get their needs met. And if you said, could we take all of these things away? I have no experience parenting a kid who's not autistic. I'm not sure how I would do it. That sounds, it's so foreign and mysterious to me that I don't understand what that would be like. And so I want to, yeah, I think so much of this discussion is coming either from people who are like, no, but I'm using this paradigm with my kids because it always makes more sense, or I am saying to myself the things that someone should have said to me when I was a kid, and I'm
Yeah.
posting through it.
And I'm deeply sympathetic to posting through it. Like, do what you need to do to get through this. But once you're through it, self-reflect a little, maybe, is what I would say. I also, like, just on the cure thing, the reason I don't talk about it is just because, I don't know, it's like saying a cure to cancer. Like, what is cancer? Cancer is
It's
10,000
so
different
many small
things.
things.
And it's like, I just don't think a cure for autism is realistic. I think, like, you're not going to cure a complex neurodevelopmental condition that starts from early childhood. You're just not. I'm sorry if that sounds pessimistic, but let's be realistic. You're not going to do that. Treatment of
And if
negative symptoms, absolutely. Like, let's treat negative symptoms. But if you're looking for a cure, it's like looking for a cure for Down syndrome. It's a chromosomal, like, Down syndrome is a chromosomal disorder, autism isn't. But like, what I'm trying to get across is, like, if you're born with Downs, you will have Downs forever. You're not going to cure Downs. You can do interventions and treatments to make it better, though, and to make the
but
lives of the people who have it better. And
that
so for
very
me,
logic, though,
yeah,
is why people get so jumpy when you start using the word cure, because if you're going to cure something with that seems to have a strong genetic component, historically, that has gotten eugenicsy real fast.
especially with genetic conditions, that gets into forced sterilization territory, and, fetal screening for abortion territory, and those types of places. I understand people being like, ooh, that doesn't sound good. I don't want RFK to forcibly sterilize me because I might produce an autistic child. That doesn't sound good. Completely get that. But I think just calling a spade at some point is necessary, and giving yourself the ability to be like, actually, I don't like being like this and I wish I wasn't, but also acknowledging, but I am, and there's not much I can do about not being like this, and so I'm just going to do the best I can with the things that I have and try to get reasonable accommodations so that I can thrive in this world.
I have learned practically that if I disclose that my kid or I or are autistic to somebody and they respond with, we see that as a superpower, that is a quick clue to me that I'm going to have to really fight for the accommodations we need, because because if they don't see it as having a disabling component, they are not going to know how know that know that we need assistance. And so romanticizing us with superpower language doesn't do us the favors that you might think it does.
Yeah, I would say it actively harms us because, like Freddie said, okay, you're Superman. What accommodations does Superman need? He doesn't.
Whenever one of my kids' teachers, it was before we were in her class, and we did say, like, hey, our kid coming into your class is autistic. We want to talk about it. And she's like, oh, we see it as a superpower. And it was immediate alarms for me. However, when we sat down and talked, we learned she uses superpower language with every kid, regardless of what they've got going on. And the way she frames it as, and every superpower's got a weakness, kid.
Mm,
And you might be Superman, but this over here is your kryptonite. So we need to work on that. And like that is how she frames it with all her kids. And I've said, okay, fine, I will give superpowers a pass for
yeah,
this. If you are
but
going to
like,
talk about the superpower having a weakness and a nemesis that is making their lives needlessly difficult, in addition to that they are super fast at this one skill, okay, let's do it.
yeah, and again, I have all the latitude for children in early childhood development. I used to mentor, like, young teenage boys, and I would just be like, yeah, dude, you are going to be a super hacker. Your brain is perfect for computers, because they were really interested in math and computing, and it's like, I need to encourage you to do this so that you can get a job so you're not starving as an adult, and so you can throw money at your accommodation issues. And many of them are now adults, and they are also computer engineers. They are my finest warriors. And like, some of them have jobs at companies that I've recommended them for. And that was necessary for them to hear at the time. Now I have frank conversations with them where they're like, I have trouble framing it as a superpower. I'm like, yeah, dude, I told you that because you were 12. I told you that because you were a kid. Kids need different messages than adults, and I don't
And
think that gets translated.
I don't think of that as lying to my kid if we nuance it with, and there's kryptonite.
Yeah, yeah, and just making sure the thing that needs to be helped is you need accommodations for your kryptonite weakness. Yeah, absolutely. So I think we'll wrap it up here, but I'll just one criticism that I think Freddie gets unfairly is that he's mean to people with ASD1, or he doesn't care about them, or he doesn't care about their feelings or their struggles. And I thought it was just fair to give him the chance to address it. And so we'll play that here and then we'll wrap things up.
I mean, look, yeah, maybe this is a good place to wrap up, but so specifically to talking about people with ASD1 and sort of, again, like I chafe at the notion that like I just sort of dismiss that condition. I think that condition needs to be distinguished in both directions, right? In other words, it is different from ASD3, but it is also different from ASD0. And I think that part of the problem, as I said before, is that like people feel like to defend ASD1, you have to defend ASD0 people. And my core contention is no, you don't. Actually, that those people make it harder for autistic people. What I would say is that, look, like there is some truth that no one is really going to be able to access about how I interact socially with people with ASD1, because that is the sort of accommodation that I am in a sort of position to provide, meaning that you have people who are really severely disabled who need a lot of help from society that are sort of that help that's formal and legalistic that I don't have any way to access. And then you have people with ASD1 who need their own kinds of accommodations that we should provide, but that, I, like every other human being, like every other, neurotypical, if you prefer, human being, have a responsibility sort of in my interactions with those people. And I'm either an asshole to them or I'm not, right? Like I either like respect and have compassion for their individual condition on a day-to-day basis, or I don't. And I don't expect your listeners to believe that I treat them respectfully, but like, that's where the rubber meets the road on that question. And so it's just not going to be available to people who only know me online. But what I will say is, like, again, to reiterate, look, like, go back to the logic of reasonable accommodation, go back to the definition of what we're doing here, which is like when people have these impairments, our societal understanding that we have a responsibility for them. What is that specific responsibility? What is the right accommodation? What is the compassionate accommodation? And I simply don't believe that the sort of screaming online activists are actually helping people with ASD1. That I don't think that their conduct in the world is actually creating a condition which is ultimately to the benefit of people who are just trying to build lives while managing a condition that for most of them is an impairment, even if it is not, and it's something that we should ever want to stigmatize them for.
All right. Any final thoughts before we shut this one down?
I will say that I completely trust and believe that when he has ASD people, when he has autistic people in his life, that he has compassion and grace for them. I can also understand why people only read encountering him in writing, why that might not come through in the writing. So I can see both of those things.
Yeah, and I just think that it's important to situate Freddie and his critique in its context, which I hope we did. I hope we did a good job of trying to explain this critique in the best possible light. And I wanted to introduce us to the critiques of it so that you can understand why people have negative reactions to neurodiversity framing. I think it's important to understand, and hopefully we did a good job of explaining this and the critique in a thoughtful and nuanced way. Thank you very much to Freddie for volunteering his time to do the interview with me. I am so sorry that I screwed up the audio and I sound like I'm recording from inside a microwave. I wish I didn't screw that up so we could have just seamlessly played the interview. Hopefully this is suitable for you. Sorry about that. I'm John. If you want to contact me, you can email me christianityonthespectrum@gmail.com. You can find me on Twitter at christianityon. You can find me on Blue Sky at christianityon.bluesky.social. We have a Discord if you'd like to join a Discord of autistics who constantly have conversations like this and also conversations about Christianity. It's mostly a Christianity Discord. So if you're from Freddy's audience,
don't go in there expecting this to be just an autism critical analysis Discord. It's mostly us posting memes about like the Council of Chalcedon. It might be a little weird
We have
if you're
very
not used to that.
complicated feelings about the Council
Yes.
of Chalcedon.
Okay, so that's all I have. Anything else, Alyssa?
Nope. You can find me on the Discord if you want to be on the Discord, or I am on Blue Sky, ALYSSAKAYE.bluesky. And yeah, that's it.
Cool. All right,
You can
we'll end
find
it
me for
here.
all of your unaccredited Latin teacher and or amateur improviser mime needs.
Yes. All right, cool. We'll sign off here. Bye.